So, okay, I will go with the in vitro digestibility, but first my disclosure. Okay, this is the disclosure for the conference. I will receive refund travel expenses for my trip. This is my disclosure, personal disclosure. I have research founded by, I still have research founded by two food companies in Italy. I have now speaker honorary and so on. Then I'm employee of the University of Parma, and my department is involved in research and technological transfer with a number of food companies, including testing glycemic index. I'm also the pro tempore president of the Italian Society of Human Nutrition, and in this case, when I do conferences and congress, I have support from pharmaceutical, food, scientific publisher, and so on. Finally, my sponsor is a scientific officer of the EFSA NDA panel, and this is a conflict of interest, of course. To mitigate the potential bias, the data that I'm presenting here are mainly derived by published literature. If I present something which is not published, there is no reference to manufacturer, distributor of the product, or whatever, which involves grants obtained by the industry. And of course, this lecture is my personal point of view about the topic. I don't endorse any service, drugs, foods, ingredients, instruments, reagents, and so on that could present a commercial interest. And to resolve the last point of my disclosure, I only discuss about food at home in deciding what to prepare for dinner. Nothing more than that. Okay, talking about in vitro methods, in vitro digestibility and marker of carbohydrate quality, we all know that reducing postprandial glucose is a good story, is a good effect, has a good physiological effect. Sorry, is important, pardon, is very important, and this both at the level of diabetic patients, but also in the general population. How we can achieve a reduced postprandial blood glucose, mainly in two ways. Either by improving the glucose disposal, for example, with the use of drugs such as insulin-enhanced agents, or by reducing the rate of glucose absorption from food. And this is the other side of the coin. So we can slow glucose entrance into the circulatory system. So two different aspects that could have the same effect, reducing the postprandial glycemia. If we use a proof of concept, a drug as a proof of concept, we see that reducing postprandial glycemia through the reduction of the rate of glucose absorption has a preventive effect on major diseases in IGTs, whereas the use of some insulin enhancers, such as the neteglinide, at the long term has no effect. So they have, of course, a useful effect in reducing the overall glycemia, the glycemic level, also many consequences of glycation of proteins, but not in preventing new cases of diabetes or cardiovascular disease. So it seems that, this is the learning tip one, it seems that from drug studies, we can affirm that limiting the rate of glucose absorption may have additional advantages on the disease risk compared to just the reduction of postprandial glycemia per se. So it's something that goes behind the reduction of postprandial glycemia. So that's what affects the rate of glucose entrance into the body. Of course, the digestive tract. So we chew the foods, pass in the stomach, then the proximal small intestine, the distal small intestine, and what is left arrives to the colon. And those are the possible point of control of the mechanism of digestion, especially when carbohydrates are involved. So the nature of the food, chewing, swallowing, the emptying of the stomach, the rate of digestion, proximal absorption, distal absorption, and the release of incretins and colonic intestinal peptides, and then colonic fermentation at the end. All these are interconnected. So we can measure, more or less, any one of these points. We can measure gastric emptying. We already know something about the mechanism which can influence gastric emptying, and we know also that gastric emptying is dependent on the presence of certain compounds in the food, such as viscous fiber, especially for liquid foods. And we also know something about the postprandial glycemia, how it's changed by gastric emptying change. Digestion absorption rate, which is the topic of this talk, of course, we can measure it in vitro. There are many different ways to measure absorption. Is influenced by a number of dietary factors, and influence the rate of delivery of glucose to portal circulation. It depends on physical state of foods, on the presence of certain fibers, but also on cooking or on the presence of enzyme inhibitors. And the last, fermentation. Fermentation, we can measure more or less fermentation by in vitro techniques, but also by in vivo methods, such as the breath hydrogen or in vivo serum acetate. Is influenced by the nature of the substrate which is fermented, the particle size of the fiber, and can influence, in turn, a lot of physiological aspects which are linked to peripheral use of glucose, such as peripheral removal or gluconeogenesis of free fatty acid suppression. Is dependent mainly by the concentration of fermentable fibers, including also the non-fiber, such as oligofructans, for example, and but also from malabsorption. For example, lactasia, so a certain amount of lactose is lost to the colon, even in lactose digester, or the fructose load. A lot of fructose can reach the colon, and then we don't know. So no, we are not a clear picture of the effect on postprandial glycemia or colonic fermentation. We only can hypothesize that the system is more complex than what we are normally thinking. So this is the postprandial glycemia, which is mainly linked to the rate of glucose entrance into the system. And this is the postprandial glycemia, which is related to the glucose disposal from the system. The two things are interconnected. And also the digestive tract is interconnected in modulating these two aspects. For example, proximal absorption increase the rate of glucose absorption, whereas distal absorption or fermentation increase the rate of glucose disposal, or the effect on gastric emptying, which is in turn related to a slower entrance of food into the intestine. So the picture is quite complex. And the learning tip 2 that I bring to you is that gastrointestinal physiology is closely linked to glucose metabolism, with many points of possible interaction, not just one, not just digestion, not just gastric emptying. There are many points. Methods exist to systematically explore some of these points, not all, and factors which affect carbohydrate appearance in the bloodstream are more or less into this picture. So digestibility of carbohydrates, which is the topic. How digestion can be measured in vitro to try to explore at least the mechanism which have been just described. First of all, carbohydrate digestibility, which is the title of my talk. What does it mean? How measures the term digestibility? Two things: the rate of digestion and the extent of digestion. So when we talk about, use the same term, but we have a double meaning. Rate of digestion, that means a proxy for proximal or distal absorption of glucose. Extent of digestion, which is a proxy for colonic fermentation. So the two blocks of my picture. We do not discuss this part because it's has already been discussed before from who talk about fiber, or grain, and we remain concentrated on the digestibility of carbohydrates related to the rate of digestion. So this is just a short summary of in vitro methods which have been applied to predict the digestibility of foods or foods in general containing carbohydrates. More than 37 have been reviewed by this guy in 2008. Those methods have been used in a large amount of papers, applied in a large amount of papers to analyze thousands of ingredients and products. It's a very large body of information that we have, but often are not information which can be used to predict something in terms of the effect on human health, just the effect on some parameters. Again, all these methods have the same final point, which is to measure different part of the carbohydrates which are contained in the food. With in vitro method, we can measure dietary fiber. We can measure in the starch the part which is resistant to, which reach the colon, the part which is slowly digestible, which is absorbed in the distal part of the intestine, and the part which is rapidly digested. And we also, with in vitro method, can, let's say, discriminate between the carbohydrates which are absorbed very, very fast and carbohydrates which are absorbed more slowly. Polyols are a sort of black hole in the classification of carbohydrates. We don't know very well neither the bioavailability, nor the site of absorption, nor the effect on fermentation. It's something that should be explored a bit more. Learning tip 3. In vitro methods may describe both aspects of carbohydrates, the extent or the rate of carbohydrate digestion. In vitro rate of carbohydrate digestion is mainly related to the rate of starch digestion and provides a proxy of proximal versus distal glucose absorption. And among these methods, the English method has been recently, 20 years now, proposed to make some order in the different fractions of carbohydrates that can be used by coming from food, and to predict some effect that food have on, for example, postprandial glycemia. What is interesting to note is that English, when wrote his paper, his seminal paper, was looking at the rapidly available glucose. So he was concentrating on the early absorption, on the fast absorption, which is found the major determinant of the glycemic response. So the correlation that he found with the glycemic index was highly significant. So the in vitro method was able to predict the glycemic index. And the significance of in vitro measurement was endorsed by his paper. And this indeed has been also a point taken by EFSA when they passed the recent claim on digestible starch and postprandial glycemia, which is a slow reduction of postprandial glycemia, is a beneficial effect for EFSA. Sorry, I'm breaking something. We can note that whereas the paper of English was focusing on the rapidly available glucose, here, in turn, what is more stressed is the presence of slowly digestible starch, which is some sort of reciprocal effect, but it is actually not the same effect that we're looking at the original paper. Anyways, this is a way that I can pass you as a learning tip 4. In vitro methods may provide a measurable ground for claiming the effect of food on glycemic response, has been done, based on quick availability of carbohydrates, mainly starch, for intestinal absorption. This should be the meaning of an in vitro method of starch digestibility or carbohydrate digestibility for predicting the glycemic response. This is quite interesting. When it's been published this paper, it was the time I was in Toronto, and swallowing food without chewing, a simple way to reduce postprandial glycemia. This is an interesting paper. I suggest you to read it. So this is wheat, corn, potato, rice, apple, eaten either by chewing them 15 times or by swallowing small pieces of food without chewing them. And you can see a major effect on reduction of postprandial glycemia. If I could measure the glycemic index here, we have a glycemic index which is very, very low. So why this picture? Because, in effect, structure is almost all when we talk about in vitro digestibility and the in vivo consequence of fast glucose absorption. Just to make it clear, in the trial, the ring test of Tom in 2003, we tested 5 foods, and some left over. I used them for doing some in vitro study just to see if I could predict the glycemic index that we found at the end as a pool of labs. And I tested them twice, one in the way they are eaten. What we see the slope of the initial in vitro digestibility, which is the fast glucose released in the first 20 minutes, 25 minutes, is very different and correlates pretty well. It explains 91% of the difference in the glycemic index observed for the same foods. So a very easy method to measure just the initial rate of glucose digestion or glucose release or started digestion in foods as eaten is able to predict the glycemic index. However, when we repeat the experiment by grinding the samples finely, so using them as a powder, what we see is that the slope is exactly the same, and there is no relationship with the glycemic index apart. So there is no difference from the starch origin. There is a difference, and we'll see later, for barley. Barley is an odd point here, and we'll see later why. So the factor which affect the rate of glucose absorption, the characteristics of foods which are related to the postprandial glycemia seems related to the structure of the food. If I mill it, they disappear. The relationship disappears. This was a paper from Rosalba and a group of Naples, where different Italian foods based on wheat were studied. There is no pasta here, but there is bread, gnocchi, pizza, and rusks, and so on. What is interesting is that the postprandial glucose response are more or less similar, apart for potato dumplings. And the digestibility shows actually the same. Potato dumplings have a lower rate of digestion. So there is a highly significant difference between potato dumplings and the other wheat-based foods, mainly due to the reduction in the digestibility of starch. How can we explore better what happens? So sometimes to be able to see helps to understand. And what we did was a scanning electron microscopy. You can see that potato dumplings have a completely different structure compared to the other foods. And especially the compact structure without holes, without porosity, is explaining the fact that starch is impaired in the accessibility to alpha amylase. So the learning tip 5 is in vitro methods provide an explanation for the main mechanism of action, so can be used to explore the mechanism of action which are linked to the glycemic response, for example, structure, and also if we can also use some new techniques such as image analysis, we can gather further evidence that the nature of starch has not so much importance. What is really important is the food structure. Going back to the barley, the barley effect. Barley is here even if it's completely milled. So there is something in barley which has to do with the digestibility of starch. And of course, this factor is the fiber, barley fiber, beta-glucan, which is a highly soluble fiber. So we tried to do just an experiment to see if you could predict easily, without a lot of, the effect of barley fiber on the digestibility of barley starch. So we prepared a few breads containing increasing amount of barley beta-glucans, and we measure the glycemic index, but also a new marker, which is a sort of very easy, practical way to measure viscosity. I finished, yep. Which is the fluidity of the chymon, of the digested, or the digesta of this bread. How can you do that? With a very practical equipment, which is a Boston viscosimeter. It's not a viscosimeter, it's a how you say that? Oh, yeah, I don't know the name in English. But it's a tool which is used in the tomato industry to measure the density of the tomato paste. The tomato paste is put into this chamber. There is a guillotine which closes the chamber. Then when you open, you measure the time that the paste employs to pour out. And it's the same with the digester. Actually, if you think about a particulate matter such as the food which is being chewed and digested in the stomach, how it comes out, how it interacts into the intestine is almost the same. And in effect, this is the increasing amount of barley beta-glucans. This is the white bread as a control, and this is the glycemic index measure for the foods, which is a perfect relationship. So I would say that with a very simple way to apply an in vitro system of digestion, which includes also measure of viscosity, we can have an information which can explain also the odds of soluble fiber-rich foods. This is the last one, I guess. Fiber is always good in decreasing the digestibility of carbohydrates. Not always. This is a paper published by a Spanish group. What they found that increasing fiber in bread by increasing bran has no effect on digestibility. However, has not a positive effect. It increases actually the digestibility of bread. And so the normal thought that the wholemeal bread has a lower glycemic index, I would not put my arm on it. And also, by looking at the structure, they found, in effect, that insoluble fiber present in bran disrupts and dilutes the gluten network and weakens the interaction between starch and gluten. So opens more room for the enzymes to break down the starch. So the learning tip 6 is the effect of dietary fiber on glucose availability vary according to the type and the food. So dietary fiber is not always the same. And simple in vitro digestibility methods, which can be also integrated with image analysis or viscosity measures, may help to predict this effect. So the overall conclusions are that postprandial glucose response is affected by how food are handled in different parts of the gastrointestinal tract, not just the small intestine. In vitro carbohydrate digestibility may represent a marker of carbohydrate quality. Yes, it may very well do it. Industrial and domestic food processing are often the major determinant of digestibility and can be also used by the consumer, by the industry, by the consumer also to manipulate starch digestibility and thus the effect of carbohydrate foods on postprandial glycemia. And finally, dietary advice on carbohydrate food selection may benefit from information from in vitro methods, but however, we have to keep in mind that in vivo data remain paramount to understand the real long-term effect. Thank you for your attention.